Alrighty, today we're talking with Dr. Jonathan White, author of many books from the Civil War era. The latest one was a collaboration with the Spared and Shared website on many letters written about Abraham Lincoln during and before the Civil War. Uh, this year is the 160th anniversary of the events of 1865, which Illinois had a hand in three major events that happened in 1865. The first being the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which Illinois was the first to ratify the 13th Amendment in February. The second being, of course, the surrender at Appomattox in the Civil War and General Grant paroling the Army in Northern Virginia. And the third, of course, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So the question that I'm asking every historian in this series is, out of those three major history-changing events on their own, which one, with the ability to look back with 2020 hindsight and the lens of history, 160 years later, do you believe probably had the biggest impact on our history 160 years now later?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would have to say it's either going to be the ratification or the passage of the 13th Amendment or the assassination of Lincoln. I mean, both of those changed the trajectory of American history, I think, in extraordinary ways. The 13th Amendment was passed by the House of Representatives on January 31st, 1865. It doesn't get ratified till December of 1865. So Lincoln doesn't live to see that brought to fruition, but he is alive to see it get through the House of Representatives. And
Hmm.
everyone who's seen the Lincoln movie by Spielberg
Hmm.
knows, Lincoln plays an integral role, although it's fictionalized in that movie, but he plays a really important role in getting it through Congress. The 13th Amendment is, of course, really important because it legally ends slavery in this country. And we kind of take for granted that slavery did exist in some places even after the end of the Civil War because places like Kentucky were not ending slavery. And even though slavery was nearly dead in Kentucky by 1865, slaveholding is still legal in Kentucky until the amendment's ratified. So the 13th Amendment is super important then for bringing freedom to the United States. So much so that, William Lloyd Garrison had founded the Liberator newspaper
Hmm.
January 1st, 1831, with the purpose of we've got to end slavery. And when the ratification comes in December of 65, he says, well, we can stop publishing this newspaper because
Yeah.
we've done that now. Um, the assassination's important for a whole host of reasons, but I think, you know, that changes the course of Reconstruction
Hmm.
because Lincoln, while he was pledged to reunification and bringing democracy back to the former Confederate states and bringing ex-Confederates back into the body politic, he wanted that to come hand in hand with Black political rights.
Hmm.
And when he dies, that becomes a much harder objective to achieve because Andrew Johnson absolutely opposes the idea of black men voting and also is adamant against radical Reconstruction plans. And so in a lot of ways, I think Lincoln's assassination is equally important, if not more so, in terms of changing the trajectory of Reconstruction as the 13th Amendment, because it leads to such a massive shift in what was the potential for Reconstruction versus what ultimately happens.
If which one, I know, like, so it's kind of almost like they kind of go hand in hand. 13th Amendment and the assassination kind of go hand in hand with what we're seeing in our country today, trying to grapple with civil rights, race relations, and almost kind of still reckoning with Reconstruction and the after effects of that today.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So the 13th Amendment, the one of the problems with the Civil War amendments, the 13th and then the 14th, which comes in 1868, and the 15th, which comes in 1870, is that they really get gutted by the Supreme Court in the years after Reconstruction. So between the Slaughterhouse case is in 1873, the Reconstruction case is in 1883, and then Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. And there's a couple
Hmm.
others, U.S. versus Cruikshank and so forth. Those amendments, which had such incredible potential, wind up having not as much of an effect on Black rights as their framers had hoped and as African Americans had hoped. I have a book that I just sent off to my publisher this morning of everything Frederick Douglass said about Abraham Lincoln.
Oh,
And
nice.
it's a really cool book. It's going to come out in October with Reedy Press. We're calling it Measuring the Man.
Hmm.
And because Frederick Douglass often talked about measuring Abraham Lincoln. And so
Hmm.
we figured like that captures Douglass's praise of Lincoln and his criticism of Lincoln. And in reading Frederick Douglass, one of the things that throughout the years before the war and then throughout the war years, he's constantly pointing to we've got to win this war in order to protect Black rights. We need to extend voting rights to African Americans so that they can then be part of the system and protect themselves without needing, extra protection from the government. And as the Supreme Court really guts the 13th and 14th and the states then gut the 15th Amendment in the years after the Civil War, Douglass is often pointing to Lincoln saying, we as a nation need to live up to Lincoln's legacy. Lincoln wouldn't have allowed this. Lincoln would have supported Black voting rights. Lincoln would have
Hmm.
supported equality. And and so as important as those amendments are in the moment that they're ratified, written and ratified in the 1860s and into 1870, they do accomplish less than advocates like Douglas hoped they would. And I think that gets to your question or your point about today. We still live with the ramifications of the fact that those amendments did not quite bring forth what their framers had hoped they would.
Yeah, and I've even noticed, even just recently, the 13th Amendment is, obviously led the way to the 14th and the 15th Amendments. And the 14th Amendment has been in the news so much, just in the last couple of months with the whole idea of birthright citizenship,
Mhm.
um, and that possibly being called into question. Um, and so without the 13th Amendment leading to the 14th and the 15th Amendment, you know, that just has things that are even so strong today that we're dealing with on a very real and very urgent matter that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 14th Amendment is probably the most consequential part of the Constitution today because Americans point to so many clauses in terms of the Due Process Clause or the Equal Protection Clause of that amendment. I mean,
Mhm.
in the 20th century, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, that or the Commerce Clause would have been the most important parts of the Constitution. And so, yeah, as we're having debates about its meaning today, we've been debating its meaning for almost 160 years.
Mhm. So, all right. Well, thank you very much for answering this tricky question and help us try to figure out how to deal with the answer still today.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't give a definitive answer picking one of the three, but I would definitely put it as either the 13th Amendment or the assassination.
So, all righty. Thank you so much.